So as we continue to look at the diversity of life, we can finally get to some organisms that look more like the things you're familiar with. Kingdom Plantae. So now what we're going to do is look at plants, terrestrial plants, and we're going to find that terrestrial plants are organized into four main groups. The land plants are organized into the Bryophytes, which are the non-vascular, non-seed plants. We're going to look at the ferns, Terrestriophytes, which is a antiquated phylum. We're not going to call it that. We're just going to call them the ferns. These are vascular plants that are non-flowering. Then we'll look at the seed plants, which are the gymnosperms, which use a seed. They're vascular, but they don't form flowers. And then finally, the most successful current group of plants, the angiosperms, which are flowering plants that bear seeds and produce fruit. So we're going to look at each of these in turn. And this is a great chart that you can summarize kind of the important aspects of each group. We only have four groups here. Within each group are many phyla. There are some dominant phyla. Sometimes we'll use the word division instead of phylum for plants, but that's an older term. I'll sometimes fall into that trap, though. The bryophytes, the mosses are Bryophyta, but there's also the liverworts and hornworts in this group. The ferns include the whisk ferns, the horsetails, and the ferns proper. And then the gymnosperms, the majority of gymnosperms are conifers, are in phylum Coniferophyta, but also includes the ginkgos and a couple of other unusual plants. And then finally, the angiosperms are many, many phyla worth of plants. Anything that has a flower is an angiosperm. We're going to look at this idea of alternation of generations, and we're going to note that the bryophytes are the only group that has a dominant, what's called gametophyte. The rest have a sporophyte that's dominant. And we're going to look at the nuances of reproduction and how plants ultimately freed themselves from water for reproduction and became very, very successful at spreading themselves across the land when ultimately we developed seeds and then flowers. So this will be our foray into the plant kingdom. Now, we need to spend a little bit more time and build some vocabulary on this idea of the alternation of generations. The plant life cycle is very different than an animal life cycle. And we've kind of gone over the animal life cycle when we talked about meiosis. This idea that as an animal, you're a diploid organism, and you have cells that undergo meiosis to produce haploid gametes. Those haploid gametes fuse and form a diploid zygote. That zygote then grows through mitosis to grow up to be you or whatever other animal you're talking about. Now, if this sounds unusual or unfamiliar to you, you need to go back and review that information. The reason we talk about all that stuff before is so that we can apply it now as we look at the different kinds of life. So most of the stuff I do is not just because I want to torture you, but because we're going to use that information and build on it. So here, though, when we talk about the alternation of generations, it's going to be a little different. So we're going to have a zygote. If we start with our diploid zygote, it's going to go through mitotic division and grow into a sporophyte, a multicellular sporophyte. That sporophyte is going to have certain tissues that undergo meiosis, not to produce gametes, but to produce spores that are haploid. All right? So remember, the key to meiosis is that it halves the ploidy. So the result of meiosis in this case is spores, and those spores are now haploid. Those haploid spores actually start to divide mitotically and grow up into another organism. So this is the next generation, and that gametophyte is haploid. So the gametophyte then goes through mitosis to produce gametes, because it can't go through meiosis again. It's already haploid. You can't have one and get half a genome. You can't have half the number of copies because there's only one copy of everything. So mitosis produces gametes. Gametes fuse and become a diploid zygote that grows up to be a diploid sporophyte, multicellular. So to give you an analogy, it would be as if people, and oftentimes the sporophytes and gametophytes look very, very different. It would be as if people, instead of combining gametes to make babies that looked like us, like babies look like us, it would be as if each of us individually could produce spores that grew up into albino land octopi. So that's something that doesn't look anything like us. But they would be our children. And they would be contributing members of society. They would be policemen and firefighters and drive your bus and, whatever, produce power. Like, they would be something very normal to us, though they looked nothing like us. Terrestrial, albino, octopi. All right, like octopuses running around, right? Our kids then would get together, and what they would do would be produce gametes. Those gametes then would fuse and form babies that looked like us again. This is why we call it an alternation of generations. It would always be grandparents would look like grandchild, right? And so the parents in between would always look different. And that's what plants do. Right? It's not always obvious to us, and we're going to learn about what to look for, but this is what plants do. Now, our first group are the bryophytes. These are the mosses. They're seedless and non-vascular. So there's our beautiful bed of moss. It's like a carpet of moss. And the reason that we most often see moss as a carpet is because it doesn't have vascular tissue. And vascular tissue are the pipes that are going to move stuff around in the plant. And without vascular tissue, you can't grow that tall because those pipes need to move water from the ground to all parts of the plant so that it can stay hydrated, because it's still aqueous-based life, right? The aqueous-based chemistry that is life. So if you don't have those pipes to move, you're dependent on diffusion, and diffusion isn't nearly as efficient as bulk flow through a pipe. So mosses tend to be very, very short, which is fine if there's nothing but mosses around or you're in the right environment. So mosses tend to be in moist environments where the water is plentiful. That's when they're growing. They're actually very, very resistant to desiccation and can kind of go into a hibernative state and then reemerge and grow when it's wet, as you would know from my roof during the winter versus during the summer. Now, let's look at a graph or a picture here that we're going to see for every group of the plants. And this is a life cycle diagram of bryophytes, okay, of moss. Now, what we're going to do is label diploid tissue with brown and haploid tissue with blue. And you can see here that most of this is blue. It's haploid. And haploid is gametophyte. The gametophyte is dominant. The moss that you see here, most of that is all gametophyte. So the gametophyte is haploid. That is the dominant generation. It's the most obvious one. It has the most biomass. So the gametophyte produces gametes. So in this case, you've got male and female gametophytes. So if you kind of start with the lower left corner where you have spores, some of those spores will germinate and grow into a female gametophyte. So it's like green carpet moss that is female. And then you have some of those grow into green carpet moss that is male. Now, the difference between male and female will be the organs that they possess. The females will possess what's called an Archegonia. And the Archegonia is the organ that has the egg in it. So through mitosis, it will produce an egg. The male will have what are called Antheridia. The Antheridia is the organ that produces sperm. So plants have sperm. And in this case, the sperm have to swim, just like animals, like many animal sperm have to swim. So it needs water to get from the Antheridia to the egg. So again, the reason we find mosses oftentimes in very moist environments is because they need the water, but they also need enough water that there's opportunity to be saturated with water, or there's a raindrop or something that the sperm can swim from the Antheridia to the egg. So sperm and egg get together, we have fertilization, and then within the Archegonia, we have zygotes forming. Those zygotes now are diploid, so you can see they're brown. Those zygotes will then go through mitosis and grow up to be the sporophyte. In this case, the sporophyte is actually dependent upon the gametophyte. It is not the dominant generation. And so what you'll do is I want you to go out and look at moss. Find some moss, and you'll see these little tiny stalks, and I'll show you a picture in a second. See these little tiny stalks arising from the green moss, and you're like, oh, what is it? I don't know what that is. That's actually the baby of the moss. That is the next generation. And within that sporophyte, sporophytes produce spores. They're going to go through meiosis to produce spores that will then grow up into more green moss, as you know and love. And so if we look at pictures, you can see moss in the upper left, and you zero in on the Archegonia, where the sporophytes, from which the sporophytes will grow when those eggs are fertilized. You can see these little stalks here on the upper right. These are actually the next generation. Those then will open at the top, release spores. The spores will then germinate into more moss. All right. So you can see here again the Archegonia on the left and the Antheridia on the right. So these now are mitotically produced gametes. All right. So let's keep that in mind. So again, as we look at our land plant summary chart, we have the bryophytes. They're seedless, non-vascular plants. The mosses, the liverworts, the hornworts. The dominant life cycle is the gametophyte, and they are dependent on water for reproduction. Why? Because they have swimming sperm. The sperm need water to swim through to get to their destination, which is the egg. Mosses are important as an erosion preventer. They are moisture reservoirs. They tend to be first colonizers because they can grow on very little soil, and they can withstand long extended periods without water where they go dormant. Now as we move forward, we're going to see the sporophyte becomes dominant, but with the ferns, they're still going to be dependent on water.